Okay, let's go. There were, of course, unaware, these good men, for Providence had not endowed many of them with the acquisitive wit of Harry Stickles. How large a portion of what came to the town from the feeding of pilgrims and from the selling of curiosities, both to the religious and to the profane, was divided among the real proletariat of the place. But since the proletariat, in its turn, not accustomed to such wealth, hurried to spend it in these very shops, there was, as can easily be believed, a sort of revival of those fortunate medieval times, when the whole of Glastonbury throve and grew fat upon the St. Joseph's pence of religious Christendom. Mr. Garrett himself, in these lucky days, grew more and more indifferent to the practical and economic aspects of his great design. Having, as we have seen, taken measures to get rid of every penny of Cannon Crow's large fortune, the mayor accepted whatever salary, as head of the commune, was set up apart for him each week by the energetic assessors, and bothered his brains no more about the matter. Had he been head of Hades, or lord of the Anwen, of which Mr. Evans had so obstinately murmured, had he been a reincarnation of the old Celtic divinity mentioned in the Mabinogi as Bendigeidfran, or Bran the Blessed, he could not have worried less about these mundane affairs. What he was now doing all this time was receiving religious disciples, or, if it is too early in the history of the new Glastonbury religion to call them by that name, followers, learners, pupils, neophytes. These he received not in Cardiff Villa. Indeed, he was seldom to be found in Cardiff Villa now. And Megan had required all her dignified rise blood to be reserved and patient over this. But in that solid erection, something between a farm barn and a collegiate chapel, which his London architect had built for him near his Saxon arch, within sound of the trickling of his fountain of life, and that had come to be called the Rotunda. It was with a positive genius for what might be named the psychic nuances of building that this great adept in stone had constructed out of timber, brought in the same woodyard of the worthy Mr. Johnson, where Mr. Evans's cross had been purchased, a sort of Platonic lecture hall. Like the Saxon arch, which now rose triumphantly over the Grail fount, this wooden erection, when Gerd first spoke of it, sounded as if it would be something in unbelievably bad taste. I guess it is actually an erection we're talking about. But the reverse of this was what developed. By an extensive use of carving, for many of the heavy crossbeams of this edifice were terminated by massive heads of the old Saxon kings, while a colossal image of St. Dunstan looked down from above the entrance. This secular hall was made to correspond with the mystical arch which covered the path to the Grail Spring. Okay, it's not actually a penis. The ritual, or if the reader prefers it, the procedure that came to establish itself in this singular hall, originated in so spontaneous and natural a manner as to excite in the architect, who refuted to leave the place till he had satisfied himself with what he did, a desire to supply an organic, outward form for such a repetition of spontaneous religious gestures. Ooh. Mr. Garrett, growing more and more obsessed by his ideas as he was given a fuller chance to express them, had caused a mysterious altar to be constructed and placed in the center of this wooden building, an altar dedicated to the worship of his heretical Christ. The bulk of this altar was made of oak, in harmony with the finely chiseled wainscoting that the architect had designed for the lower portion of the walls. But on the top of this wooden base, placed there suddenly in the night, none but Mr. Garrett himself knowing its origin, appeared a square slab of about 5 inches thick, of a substance, color, texture, and polish completely different from any stone that had, until that day, been found in Glastonbury. Mr. Merry, the curator, shook his head very knowingly after he had spent some time examining the stone, which he declared was much older than the one in St. Patrick's Chapel, and in private consultation with his nephew, Paul Trent, he maintained the daring opinion that it was an altar stone of the Bronze Age, probably used in the invocation of some god of fertility. How Mr. Merry deduced this opinion, of what evidence he found for it in his examination of the stone, had not become common knowledge, for the curator held the view that there were enough mischief-makers already in the town, and far too much talk about subjects which, in wiser times, were restricted to the learned alone. Our architect from London, however, by no means confined himself to the erection of this altar upon which Bloody Johnny's younger daughter had placed it, little vases of clear glass, the season's earliest primroses. He also caused it to be constructed, in the same solid oak, a hieratic seat for the founder of the new Western religion. Few things about this Hall of Marvels, as John Crow called it, interested the mayor less than this pontifical throne. Its extreme discomfort was, nevertheless, modified by Megan Gerd as soon as she saw it. She unceremoniously threw over it the familiar threadbare bearskin snatched up from the floor of the Cardiff Villa drawing room. The architect did make a somewhat wry face when he saw what she had done, but he uttered no overt protest, and from his place in the singular chair of office Mr. Garrett continued to expound day by day. It seemed to be the dominant purpose of his life now, and he pursued it with massive concentration, the doctrine of his new mystical faith. The strange man never lacked an audience for these uninterrupted discourses. Sometimes, indeed, that circular hall was packed tightly with people. But whenever there were many there, or the merest handful, the mayor would always be ready to carry further and further his mystical doctrines about the blood of his Glastonbury Christ. Megan and Crummy brought him his meals once or twice out there, but this soon became unnecessary because Mrs. Jones, Sally's mother, who through Red Robinson, her son-in-law, possessed an advantage over the other tea shops of the town, started a refreshment booth just inside the entrance of Chalice Hall. This ramshackle edifice, run up overnight by some artisan relative of Mrs. Jones, ruined entirely, from a purely aesthetic point of view, the whole beauty of what the architect had done. But the architect only laughed when this was pointed out to him, declaring that the reason why the gaudy tinsel ornaments in a Roman church were less irreligious than the collegiate dignity of a London church was that they were the expression of the inherent barbarism and crudity of rank human nature with which any genuine religion, to be really organic, must keep in close touch. Our communal refreshment booth, he said to Paul Trent, whose taste was offended by this circus-looking shanty, is like the crowds of beggars outside St. Peter's, or the guides outside the Mosque of Zomar. If Glastonbury is destined to become, as with all these foreigners it looks as if she were, a mystical rival to Rome and Jerusalem, you must expect worse things than a few catch-penny cook shops. Oh, I haven't been to a good catch-penny cook shop in a while. And indeed, with this concession of the architect, for the man had come to exercise the dominant influence over what was going on in Chalice Hill, Mrs. Jones' initiative was followed by a rush of enterprising peddlers, who set up far more unsightly stalls than hers. They had to turn over their gains to the assessors every evening, but as their bookkeeping was very casual, and as private property, in spite of Dave Spear, still existed in Glastonbury, It was an extremely approximate sum that was thus poured daily into the community's exchequer. Exchequer? Exchequer? I don't know how to pronounce it. But the heart of Glastonbury was still the fountain on Chalice Hill. To this fountain, passing to and fro under the Saxon arch, came a constant influx of visitors. Mr. Gerd had insisted upon one restriction alone, namely, that there should be no sacerdotalism. That there should be no sacerdotalism. Sacerdotalism. Women were allowed to come bareheaded. Men were allowed to bring their hats and sticks. Children were allowed to drift in and out at will. At the fountain itself, dressed in corduroys like a gamekeeper, stood, in the morning, none other than our friend, young Toosey, while in the afternoon, when the crowds were much greater, a strapping youth from the upper Mendips, who had been converted by Bloody Johnny in his street-preaching days, and who was too simple in his wits to notice the difference between what the man taught now and what he had taught then, kept the crowd in order. This powerfully built lad had been dismissed for pouching by one of Lord P's tenant farmers, and he had turned up in Glastonbury in his old-fashioned shepherd's smock with an eye to communal flocks and herds. It had been Paul Trent, the only one of the town's rulers who had the faintest artistic feeling, who had advised Garrett to let the lad wear this primitive garment when he was about the business of guarding the Grail Spring, and the mayor, who remembered a highly colored picture of his native national school of our Lord himself, clothed in a costume resembling that of old Bill Chant, Farmer Manley's head shepherd, had jumped at this proposal. Curiously enough, it was the Eastern European visitors, or pilgrims, if you will. And indeed, there were many of both types who seemed more impressed by these discourses of the head of the new commune. And among these, none were more affected than certain monastic wayfarers from the slopes of Mount Athos. There was no lack of scribes taking serious and copious notes of all the man said. And although the London papers had grown weary of him, Gerd of Glastonbury was already a legendary figure in Bulgaria, in Bessarabia, and in many a remote religion treats upon the Black Sea. The main drift of Gerd's singular gospel was that an actual new revelation had been made in Glastonbury. The crucial thing for Western humanity at this moment was to concentrate a magnetic flood of desperate faith upon this magic casement, now pushed a little open. Scientists, explained Mr. Gerd, only he used homelier and less abstract language, are continually finding a new cosmic vibrations, totally unknown or only suspected before. And why should now not a new element belonging to the unknown dimension in which our present dreamlike floats be discovered by psychic in place of psychological experiments? It is all a matter of experience. The miraculous is as much a portion of the experience of our race as is the most thoroughly accepted scientific law. The human soul, so Mr. Gerd, in his sublime ignorance of modern phraseology, hesitated not to declare, possesses levels of power and possibilities of experience that have hitherto been tapped only at rare epochs in the world's history. These powers we who live in Glastonbury must now claim as our own, and not only enjoy them for ourselves, but fling them abroad throughout the whole earth. It was on the 15th of March that Mr. Gerd's morning discourse, for he was often found in his heathen pantheon, and Mr. called it, as early as 8 o'clock, was interrupted in the startling and dramatic manner that had now become part of Glastonbury's history. There had been disturbing news for the past 3 days from Burnham and Heybridge. On the 12th of the month, information had come to the town of the flooding of the Parrot Valley as far as Bridgewater, and of the complete submerging of such low-lying districts as Horsey Level, Puritan Level, and Paulet Hams. On the 13th, the long-stretching clay banks that defended the mouth of the Brew were reported to be down and the Burnham and Evercreech line under water. By the afternoon of the 14th, there was definite news that a great flood was advancing rapidly, hour by hour, between Tandem Moor and Catcott Birtle, and that the flats from Moor Pool to Decoy Rhine, and from Decoy Rhine to Mudgley, were already one unbroken lake. On the night before the 15th, many old residents of Glastonbury who realized the danger much better than the younger generation refused to go to bed. In several of the workmen's cottages down by the river on the way to Street, and in others in the district called Beckbury, people carried their more precious belongings into their upper rooms before they dared to sleep. And in not a few of the smaller beer houses, certain among the habitual chopers refused to go home that night. Well, things are really coming to an end here. The flood is coming, my friends. The flood is coming. But not tonight. It's not coming tonight. We're gonna keep it away as long as we can. Till next time. Cheers from Glastonbury.